not only has my job changed several times since I've been at Westview, our logo has changed 3 different times in the past 30 years. But more importantly, our program has. When I first started at Westview, we had what some would refer to as a cookie cutter approach to taking care of boys, which means we would treat every boy the same and expect him to act the same. And that's just not the way kids work. They aren't the same. And so we've started using a program that I will talk about here in just a bit. A lot of our program now is based on what we call trauma-informed care. A lot of boys who end up needing to have a place to go to live have gone through significant trauma in their lives. And we need to understand that and understand how it is that those difficulties that they've faced affect their behavior. For example, since 1956, Westview Boys Home has been taking care of boys who've been orphaned, abandoned, abused, neglected, boys who've been in trouble with the law but don't need to be locked up. They just need a lot of good structure and supervision that they're not able to get in their home environment. And so a lot of times the court will tell parents, in Oklahoma we don't contract with the court, so what the courts there do is they tell the parents, either you place the boy at Westview or we're going to place him in a detention facility. And most times the parents would prefer that the boy come live with us because that allows them to come visit their boy, and if the boy behaves well enough, he gets to go home to visit his family a couple times during the year as well. And so that's something that happens with us. The other part of the trauma-informed care is we work with a program that was developed by a Dr. Karen Purvis and a Dr. David, and I can't remember David's last name all of a sudden here, but they worked with Texas Christian University and came up with a program working with young people who have problems with what's called reactive attachment disorder. A lot of times when a young child is born and they don't get the attention they should be getting, they have a hard time being able to attach with adults and with their family. One of the things that happens, for example, years ago, it was very common for families here in the United States to adopt babies from Russia. And what would happen is those babies had been living in basically a warehouse with very little person-to-person contact. And one of the things that I learned, I got my master's degree from the University of Oklahoma in psychology, and one of the things we learned back then was that when a child is being fed, the worst thing a parent can do is take and stick a bottle in their mouth and prop up the bottle. Because what a baby goes through in their very early childhood is when they're being held like this to either nurse or to be fed a bottle, they get very good eye-to-eye contact. And if they don't get that eye-to-eye contact, they don't learn how to develop relationships. And so that's what leads to this thing called reactive attachment disorder. And one of the things that I've seen several times through my years at Westview is here you have this child who's been adopted and they haven't figured out how to establish relationships in a good way. And when they come to live with us, first they've been, in their minds, abandoned by their birth parent. And then when their adoptive parents say, I can't deal with this because we're not establishing a good relationship, and there's so many things that are very difficult in that relationship, that they too then kick that boy out of their house to place the boy with us. And so what happens with young people sometimes is they get with us and they're thinking, and here's how their thinking goes, they feel, you know, my mom abandoned me, my adoptive family abandoned me, and sooner or later, you're going to abandon me too. And so rather than me waiting to be hurt by you, let me behave in such a way that we get this over with quickly. And so they misbehave, thinking that we're going to abandon them. I've seen young men who were adopted as babies, who they turned about 12, 13 years old, and their adoptive parents get divorced. And the adoptive parents each say to the boy, we adopted you when you were a baby, but you're not a baby anymore, and neither one of us wants you. I just saw a shocked look I miss that shocked look because it doesn't surprise me anymore. In my years prior to coming to Westview, like I said, I was a full-time preacher, part-time police officer, and my wife and I became foster parents for a young girl. She was 16 years old at the time. From the time she was 3 years old, her father had sold her into prostitution so he could buy drugs. When she came to live with us, everything she brought with her, all her personal possessions, she brought in trash bags. And if everything you own belongs in trash bags, what's that say about how valuable you are? I wish I could say she was the only case I've seen with that. I've seen that so many times with our boys when they've come to live with us. We had one donor who, when he heard about our boys coming with trash bags, he said, I'm going to buy a bunch of duffel bags. I found this place I can buy duffel bags, and I'm going to send you duffel bags so kids no longer have to move from place to place in trash bags. And I said, oh, have I got a deal for you? I said, how much were you going to pay for those bags? I have a little side business that does signs and graphics, and we do things like embroidery and silk screen printing and vehicle graphics and so forth. I started that so my kids would have a place to work, then they grew up and left home. Anyway, so he told me what he was going to get and how much it was going to be, and I said, well, one of my suppliers sells much nicer duffel bags for about half of what you were going to pay. And so and I talked to my boss because I'm very careful about not having a conflict of interest, and I only charged him what my company supplier charged me. And so he bought at one time 10 cases of duffel bags, and he said, when you run out of those, let me know, because I don't want these boys to ever go from place to place with their clothing and possessions in trash bags. Having to move with everything you own in trash bags is traumatic. And so our trauma-informed care, one of the things that we use, like I was talking about with trust-based relational intervention, is we try to build trust. And one of the ways we build trust is by saying yes as often as we can. And for example, a boy comes up to the house parent, we used to call them house parents, we now call them caregivers, because when a boy is court-placed and his mom's not happy and she hears somebody referring to themselves as the boy's parent, even if it's house parent, you're not his parent, I am. And that builds a hostile relationship. And so by us calling them caregivers, that eliminates that, and we tend to get along better with parents who've been forced to place their boys with us. Anyway, when a boy comes up to the caregiver and says, hey, there's candy bars in the pantry, can I have one? And supper's about to be served, what's mom's average response? No, we're about to eat supper. Now, when a child who's gone through trauma experiences that no, they don't hear it as saying, no, not right now, but maybe later. What they hear is, no, you can't have it, and I'm not going to give you what you think you need. And so what we've taken to doing is saying, yes, you can have that candy bar. I'll tell you what, we're about to have supper, but you go ahead and grab that candy bar and set it by your plate, and as soon as you finish supper, you can have it. And that helps build trust. Another thing we do is, rather than scolding and getting on boys' cases when they do something wrong, we tell them, you know, the way you just handled that wasn't very respectful. And respect is important to us. We have 5 elements of respect that we repeat over and over again. We want the boys to respect God, to respect self, to respect others, to respect property, and to respect nature. And we found that when people do that, life tends to be better. And so we say, that wasn't very respectful, and that really wasn't the best way to handle that. Would you like a redo? In other words, would you like to try over again and do it a better way? What I've seen happen just blows my mind, because it used to be in our older program, we had enforced discipline that was external. But with giving boys a chance to do a redo, we found that they establish a self-discipline that's even better. Give you an example. The man who's our executive director right now, his name is Terry Owens. And Terry was giving some people a tour of our campus one day, people who were potential donors, and they were in this one house. He was showing the people the house, and a boy comes in from outside, slams the door, walks up to Terry and starts cussing up a storm. and says, "Can I go to my room?" And Terry said, "Yes, please." That's not the situation you want to have when you have potential donors standing there. A few minutes later, though, the boy came back out and he said, "Mr. Terry, can I have a redo?" And Terry said, "Certainly." And Terry thought he was going to start with where the cussing started, but no. The boy went back out the door, closed it quietly, opened it, closed it quietly, walked up to Terry and said, "Mr. Terry, this is what just happened outside and it really upset me. What should I do?" That's a whole lot better than us scolding the boy for the bad language, because now he's doing things the right way of his own accord. And so we've had some changes, and I think they're really good changes. When we first started working with the Trust-Based Relational Intervention, TBRI, I wasn't sure how it was going to work, but it has made a huge difference in the lives of boys. As a matter of fact, because our program works the way it is, probation officers have us come training for them, do training for them. Parents in churches have us come do parenting training, because we can help people be better parents. There's no such thing as a perfect parent. I have been one for decades, but I'm not perfect, and there are still things that I could learn to do better. Even still, as being a parent in my 60s with kids that are in their 30s, I can still do better than what I do. And so we provide this training. We also provide it for schools, for teachers, on how to provide trauma-informed care for their students, because a lot of students in schools face a lot of trauma. We also provide it for other children's homes. The biggest children's home in Oklahoma right now is Tulsa Boys Ranch up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They have 250 staff members. And in recent years, they've had us come twice a year to provide training for their staff, because they understand that what we're doing is extremely effective. And so those are some of the changes. And so Westview, in going through all these changes, one of the biggest changes recently is Ron Bruner retired. Ron had been our executive director for 25 years, and he retired last year. And so he and his wife moved to where they could be closer to their grandkids. I understand that motivation. I love that we have one of our granddaughters 45 minutes away, but the other one lives in Lubbock. I wish I could be by both of them, because I love them both dearly. But he wanted to move closer to grandkids, and he had some other projects that he wanted to work on. So Ron did a lot of good for the home through 25 years. He was the executive director at Westview Boys Home longer than anybody else. And then Terry Owen came to be our executive director. Terry, when he was a teenager, his parents were caregivers at Westview. And then when Terry was a young adult, he became a caregiver at Westview. Moved away, came back several years later and worked with us in various ways. And he was a caregiver for a while. Then he worked with our transitional living program. We stopped calling it that because the word transitional living has come to mean something else politically these days. And we are not transitioning boys into girls. Let me just state that quite obviously. But we now call it our launch program. And we'll talk a little bit about that here as we go forward. But he ran that there in Hollis for a time, and then he became the director of facility operations. In other words, he was responsible if some plumbing broke down, or if anything needed repaired, or a car needed repaired. He took care of all those things. And then he's now our executive director. Another great thing that's happened is we had a man who was one of our caregivers for several years a while ago come back to work with us. After Jason left Westview, he went to work for the Children's School Department, and he became a school diagnostician, which means he's the person who does the testing for young people who need to have an individual education plan called an IEP. And many of our boys have been failing educationally and need to have an individual education plan. So now, instead of having to wait for the school to do the testing, we have a person on staff that can do the testing and give the school the results, and he can even help the school with their testing, which improves our relationship with the school as well. Jason is the most gentle, kind man I think you could ever meet in your life. I love him dearly. And his office is right next to mine, and he goes out for walks every afternoon. I ask him to walk a little bit further so I can count some of his as my steps. but he's a wonderful young man. I say young man, he now has one of his kids graduated from college, 2 of them are in college, and then he's got 2 teenagers, twins, who just turned 16, and his daughter got her driver's license this week. So, but Jason's a great guy. Now, we have 3 main programs, and one of the things that I'll do is I'll mention the fact Westview Boys Home is not going anywhere. We're going to continue providing care for young people who are school-aged, ages 11 through 18, there in Hollis. A lot of people have heard about us starting a new program in Weatherford, Oklahoma. We're not closing down the Westview operation. We do it, and we do it very well, I believe. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been there for 30 years. When I went to Westview, I thought if I could be there for 5 years, I'd be doing good, and here I am 30 years later. 5 years had been the longest I'd ever lived anywhere in my life. Anyway, so Westview Boys Home in Hollis, Oklahoma is the first program. That's the one that started back in 1956. If you haven't thought about it yet, we are in our 70th year right now of taking care of boys. The second program is Westview Launch. I'll talk a bit about that as well. And then Westview Family Services. Westview Family Services is a program where we do the training for parents. We've done some counseling for parents and families, and we may get back to doing more of that, but it's also the program where we provide counseling for our boys as well. So talk about Westview Launch for just a little bit. This is for young people ages 18 to 24 who have aged out of foster care or aged out of residential care. There's some harsh realities that we were forced to face some years ago here. What happened was we had a trainer come to Hollis to do training for our staff, and the trainer at one point asked a question that really hit us hard. She said, how many of you, when you left home the first time, ended up having to move back in with your parents? 75% of us had to do that as young adults. I was the all-star. I did it 3 different times. And she said, what happens to your boys when they face that situation? That opened our eyes. You see, when a young child ages out of residential care or out of foster care, there's not a whole bunch of resources for them. As a matter of fact, changes in the law have affected the way we can do things. Years ago, it used to be if a young man left the home and after he turned 18 and wanted to come back, so long as he still stayed in high school, we could bring him back, no questions asked. We had, for example, one young man on his 18th birthday said, that's it, I'm leaving, I'm done. He's an adult, we couldn't force him to stay. 3 months later, he calls us and says, I'm living on the streets in Utah, can somebody come get me? And we talked about it because he had created a whole bunch of problems when he left. And we talked about it as the administrative team and came up with the answer. You know, Jesus speaking about the story of the prodigal son, the father was just waiting for that boy to come back. And if it was my own biological child, I could not say no. You can't come home. And so we shouldn't say no to this boy either. So we let him come back. And that's all we had to do. Then the law changed and said, well, you can bring those boys back, but they can't stay in a house with other boys. So that meant if you only had one boy in that situation, you had to use one whole house just for him and couldn't take care of any other boys there. Then they said, not only does he have to stay in a different house, but you have to do a fingerprint background check on him, and we have to be able to say whether you can let him come back or not. And then it got to the point where they said, no, you can't let those boys come back to Hollis, to your campus in Hollis. The laws have changed, and not in good ways in that regard, I don't think. And so those were some changes that took place. In the USA these days, according to Axios, The most recent census data was from 2020, and so this is a few years old, but it still applies, and I don't think things have gotten any better based on the way inflation has been. Axios said that current census data shows that 87% more adults between the ages of 25 and 34 are living at home with their parents compared to just 20 years ago. Bloomberg Analysis did a report and said nearly half of young adults live with their parents. This rate has not been seen since the 1940s. That's about 23 million adults between the ages of 18 and 24 who live with their parents. The USA did a 2020 Pew Research Center said 52% of young adults between the ages of 18 and 29 lived at home with their parents. This rate has not been seen since the Great Depression. And I think when we compare today's numbers to the numbers of the Great Depression or the numbers of the 1940s, if you look back to those days when young adults lived with their families, some of you are way too young to remember the Waltons, but some of us remember. Why did young adults live with their parents back in those days? It wasn't because the young adults couldn't make it on their own, but it was because the parents needed the young adults to help them run the family farm or to help them with the family business. In the case of the Waltons, it was they had a sawmill where all the boys, even when they were adults, continued working with their dad. As a matter of fact, there in that house, at times, there was 4 generations that all lived under one roof. Today, when young people move back in with their parents, yes, sometimes it's because the parents need the young person's help. But the greatest majority is because the young person can't make it on their own out in the world, and they need their parents' help to get able to launch again. When we started Westview Launch, we started it there in Hollis. We used one of our houses because we could do that legally at that point. And the intention of Westview Launch was to help young people get out from living under the care of the adults and be able to make it on their own. But in able to do that, they needed a couple things. They needed, some of them, more education, whether it be college or a trade school. The problem with Hollis, in Hollis there are no trade schools, and there are no continuing education opportunities in Hollis. The nearest one is 40 miles away in Altus. We got Western Oklahoma State College, which is a 2-year school. They also have a trade school there, but because Hollis years ago had chosen not to be part of the group that supported that school, kids from Hollis weren't allowed to go to that trade school. Unless they had an opening, but the openings always went to kids from the other towns first. So there wasn't that available. Secondly, another problem with Hollis, there's no jobs for young people. I mentioned that I have a small signs and graphics business. I started it so my kids would have a place to work, because I wanted my kids to learn to work. And there's just no jobs in Hollis for young people. So much so that nearly every young person I've known who's grown up in Hollis, over 90% of them no longer live there after they graduate from high school. There's just nothing there for kids. Another problem with Hollis, there is nothing to do for young people. And if kids don't have something to do, they'll find something to do, as our executive director when I first moved to Westview told me. If you don't give them something to do, they'll find something to do, and it won't be what you would ask. And so that was a problem with Hollis. So we decided that we'd rent a duplex in Altus, because at least there's a college there. There's a few more jobs there for young people. And we had boys living in both sides of the duplex. The problem was that there weren't any adults on site. And when problems came up, the closest adult was 45 minutes away. That didn't work well. The next thing that ended up coming up was we had some friends that I thought were from Mustang. They were actually from Tuttle. They came to know our boys because they volunteered at the Christian camp that our boys went to. And this young couple came up to our executive director at the time, who also volunteered at the same camp the same week that our boys went. And they said, we've heard about the problems you're having with your young adults program, and we think we can help. The husband worked for a trade school up in the Oklahoma City area. He and his wife owned a small flower shop, and they said, we've got an apartment on the back of our house that we'll rent you, and we'll be the mentors for the boys to help them become adults. And what we will do is we will hire them at our flower shop, and they can go to the trade school where my husband teaches, and they'll have transportation to and from school that way, and just, it seemed like the perfect environment, and it was wonderful. Problem was, they could only take care of 2 boys at a time. One of the coolest things they did, she became pregnant, and they had a baby, and they insisted that the boys help change diapers. Because her thinking and his thinking was, if the boys have to change diapers, they're not going to be in any hurry to become a parent themselves. I think it worked. As a matter of fact, I know it seems to have, because none of them ended up being parents at that time. We had one young man who went through their program. He had been a boy at Westview for several years. He came to Westview because his family hated him. Not his mom. His dad abandoned him at a young age. His mom went to prison for meth production and sale. And the rest of her family hated her. She was the black sheep of the family. And because she was the black sheep of the family, as they referred to it, they hated the boy as well. So much so that one of his uncles said, if I ever get a chance to kill that boy, I will. So a church elder called me and said, can you all help this young man? We helped him. He even went to state in weightlifting, and I told the elder about all his success there. And then when he went into this trade school, he finished trade school, did a great job. And the elder told me, he said, Chip, I know I've told you before that you all saved this boy's life. I wasn't speaking in hyperbole. He said, that's when I found out about the uncle that wanted to kill the boy, literally. That boy went through this house and is doing great nowadays. So Mustang was limited. We started looking, trying to find property in Oklahoma City area, Yukon, Mustang, somewhere around there. Problem with Oklahoma City is everything's very expensive. Property was so expensive that property that would be acceptable to us, we couldn't afford. And property we could afford was 30 minutes away from public transportation and would need to have infrastructure taken 3 miles to get to it. Sewer lines, water lines, electrical, all that stuff. And we would have had to pay for it. So we couldn't afford it even. And so some friends started saying, y'all need to look at Weatherford, Oklahoma, because Weatherford's got some great benefits. Number one, there's Southwestern Oklahoma State College. I understand somebody here is very familiar with that. As a matter of fact, we've got a student here who's on summer break right now who goes to Weatherford. There's also 3 trade schools within 30 minutes of Weatherford. Property is far less expensive than Oklahoma City and Weatherford. And along with that, while the property is less expensive, there's great things for kids, great jobs for kids in Weatherford, because Weatherford's a very young people friendly community. And there's a congregation there that loves working with young people, college age. As a matter of fact, they operate the Bible chair just off Southwestern Oklahoma State College's campus. And there's lots of things, more things for young people to do. In Weatherford, if a young person needs to get from one place to another, they can have a subscription that allows them to hop on a scooter that's electric and take it from one place to another and just leave it there so another kid can pick it up and take it where they need to go. Just some cool things that happened there. And so we started looking at Weatherford, and it started making some sense to us. And right about that time, we all of a sudden find this piece of property of 6.74 acres, and somebody left Westview in their will. and their will gave us enough money to buy that piece of property. It seems like up to this point, God had been closing doors left and right. And all of a sudden, here we are. I saw that as God opening a door. Cool thing about that property, one of the worst things about Hollis, Oklahoma is Hollis, one newspaper referred to it as the road to nowhere. People don't show up in Hollis accidentally, and we don't have very good visibility in Hollis. If you drive through Hollis, you could drive right past our offices in downtown Hollis and never even notice they're there. And our houses in Hollis are spread out over 1,500 acres throughout the county. We're not very visible, so much so a judge one time introducing Ron Bruner, who was our executive director back then, to a social club, said, "I'd like to introduce to you Ron Bruner. He's the executive director of Oklahoma's best kept secret." When you're in a nonprofit, you don't want to be a secret because you depend on people knowing about you in order to support you to get the work done. So the property we found, the north end of the property is right up along a service road for I-40. The south end of the property butts right up against a neighborhood. It was ideal. You couldn't find a better piece of property for what we wanted to do. God opened door number 2. Then, to start building the neighborhood there in Weatherford, we were going to have to raise $1.26 million. And that $1.26 million would cost or would pay for all the engineering reports, getting a plat that could be approved by the city leaders, and putting in the infrastructure like water lines, sewer lines, even putting in the cul-de-sac, the road. Thing is, after you spend all that money on the infrastructure, it then immediately becomes the property of the city. So you have no value in it, as far as financial value goes that way. And the money was going to pay for the first 3 houses. We were going to build 5 houses, and we had gotten to the point where we were going to take out a loan to build the last 2 houses we were going to build in phase 1 of this. Well, the reason I'm doing fundraising and do the job that I do now is because one day I accidentally wrote a grant proposal that got approved. And so now I'm the fundraiser. And so there was a foundation that I had become familiar with that had done several good things for the home through the years. And I wrote to them telling them about what we needed to start working on building the Westview Launch neighborhood. Within a matter of just a few days, they sent me a letter back saying, "You've got the $1.26 million. My boss at the time, talking about capital campaigns, said, "I've never seen any capital campaign go that quickly, especially not for $1.26 million. He had expected it was going to take us at least 5 years to do. So anyway, our general contractor, he grew up in Hollis. His father and I served together as elders for the Hollis Church of Christ. And he said, "I'll be your contractor, and I won't charge you anywhere near as much as I normally charge people to be their general contractor. Not only that, but I'll talk to all my subcontractors and tell them that we're going to be building 5 houses, so I don't want them to charge you nearly as much for those 5 houses as they normally would." Every single one of the subcontractors agreed. "I'll talk to my suppliers," he said, "and talk them down in price too," and he did. Then we had a problem. There was a gas line that ran right underneath our property, right where we were going to build the houses. And the gas line needed to be removed. So we called the gas company and the engineers department. The engineers kept saying, "No, it first needs to be approved by the people who actually moved the gas line." And the people who actually moved the gas line said, "No, the engineers need to come up with a plan before we can move it." And they kept bouncing us back and forth. And then we got a call from a friend of the home who said, "Hey, do you by any chance know this gentleman?" It was a boy I had known when he was a kid, showing animals in the livestock shows in Hollis. I said, "Yes." They said, "Call him. He's the chief engineer for that gas company." Within a few days, the gas line got moved. God was opening doors left and right. Just amazes me. Then we got a $100,000 matching grant. What the matching grant is foundation says they'll give you a certain amount of money, and if you raise that amount of money, they'll match it. If you only raise a small amount of that, for example, if you raise $10, they'll only give you $10. They gave us a year to raise $100,000, and that was to provide for the cost of the home for the neighborhood for the first year. Just a few days before the end of the year deadline, we ended up getting the last $10,000 we needed to get to $100,000. A church had been sitting on some money for a time, and they got upset about themselves sitting on the money. They said, we've got this CD we're going to cash and give you the money for. God was opening doors. And then here recently we had a surprising week. It was last June. My wife and I were on vacation visiting family, and I got an email from my boss saying, when you get back, first bell, right? Okay, I'm running behind, sorry. He said, when you get back, we need to raise another $100,000, so start thinking about how you're going to do that. Went to church in Kearney, Nebraska Wednesday night because I wanted to see our church family there. Then traveled home Thursday. Friday morning I go into my office. I send an email to a friend who works with a foundation. 10 minutes later I walked into my boss's office and I said, we've got the $100,000. He said, yeah, I know. I told you that last week that we've got this matching grant. Now we need to figure out how to get the other $100,000. And I said, actually no, it was $250,000, excuse me, because each one of the houses cost $250,000. So I walked into his office. I said, no, you don't understand me. We've got the matching $250,000. He turned and his jaw dropped. It took us a year to raise $100,000. But here in a matter of 10 minutes, God took care of the need. So I'm going to skip through some things. That shows right where our property is there in Weatherford, and compared to Walmart, it's walking distance to Weatherford Church of Christ, walking distance to Walmart. Nice piece of property. That shows the shape, and that shows where the houses are. When we opened up the facility back last spring, we had KOCO News out of Oklahoma City come and do a report. So this is whoops, back up.
Like any other neighborhood in Oklahoma, but this is a new community, a safe space for young men who've aged out of Oklahoma's foster care system to learn the necessary skills needed to become a successful adult. These cheerful homes paint a picture of what Westview Launch hopes to give these young men a happy future.
There's a lot of kids that are aging out of foster care that turn 18 and they no longer can stay in the system.
Every year, Westview says hundreds of foster youth in Oklahoma transition out of the system with nowhere to go. 1 in 4 will become homeless within 2 years, and 50% will be unemployed by age 24. To curb the problem, Westview is giving them a fresh start with a community built for them.
We come in, we've got a full bath here, and 2 young men will share this bathroom, and they have 2 bedrooms here, washer and dryer and everything they need.
These young men are they're normal young men who like he said, may not have had a good start in life, but that doesn't mean that the rest of their life can't be awesome.
Gary and Mary Smith are the mentors. They live on site, offering guidance and even that parental push many of these young men have never had, teaching them how to get insurance, make a doctor's appointment, do laundry, cook, everything that goes into being an adult. Skills the Smiths say have to be taught.
That's one of the first questions I ask them is, what is it you want your life to be like in 5 or 10 years? And when they tell me, then I have something to work on and say, okay, this is what we can do, kiddo, and we can make it happen so that maybe your children won't have the same start in life that you had.
Now Westview is asking the community to share their talents through skills building and opportunities.
Gives them the opportunity to go out there and test the waters, and if they fall, they have somebody to help them up and dust them off and get them back on track again.
Reporting, Kylie Thomas, KOCO 5 News.
Gary and Mary Smith, the mentors there, he's a retired state trooper. Couldn't ask for a better couple. She's a great cook and she fixes food for them once a week. The other times the boys are responsible for it. Since we're running out of time, I've got a couple things I really need to mention. We are looking currently to have some more caregivers join our team, people who see the need and are willing to minister in that way. If that's something any of you would be interested in, please contact us. If I understand a lot of you, that would not be for you. Please keep us in your prayers that God will send us workers. Because right now there at Westview in Hollis, the boys' home, we can only bring in so many boys because we got 2 of our houses that aren't staffed right now. That makes a huge difference. We need help. The other thing we need help with is we have 3 house roofs and our office roof need to be replaced. We do have insurance. We are responsible in that way, but insurance in the state of Oklahoma, and I think in some places here in Texas, has changed through the years. We used to have a $5,000 deductible for per property. And then they said it's 1% of the property value. And then it became 2% of the property value. And then now it's 5%, not just of that one location, but of our whole property. And so if we filed a claim, it's going to cost us $108,000 to replace those roofs. If we were to file a claim, insurance, we'd have to pay that percentage, and it comes to $104,000 that we'd have to pay out of our pocket. The insurance would then only pay $4,000 of it. And then next year when premiums come around, our premium would go up because we filed a claim. And so it's better for us to just replace the roofs ourselves than to file a claim. A foundation has graciously offered us $54,000 in a matching grant, and we need help getting there. Sometimes raising funds goes a whole lot quicker than other times, but this time right now, this is a hard time. Fortunately, we do have the one foundation that said, yes, we'll be glad to give you that $54,000 matching grant. We talked to some other foundations, and they said, we'd love to help you, but we can't at this time. We believe in what you're doing, but we just don't have the money available to give right now because of other things that we've been funding. And so if you can help us in any way, believe me, I would appreciate it. We sent out an email here just the other day. Josh Burney, who works with us, does a lot of marketing for us, and he's the one who coordinates the emails. And we got in $1,200. And recently I did a presentation where we got a little bit to help with this. But we're still over $50,000 away from getting the match. So if that's something you could or would help with, it would be greatly appreciated. I have more to talk about, but I'm out of time, so thank you all very much. Oh, one of the things I was going to mention, they mentioned 25% of young people who age out of foster care in the state of Oklahoma become homeless within their first 2 years. 20% become homeless day one they turn 18. Nationally, 30% become homeless by the time they turn 20. And we're helping boys who've aged out of foster care and we've even got some boys who came to us from a New Mexico children's home because they couldn't stay there any longer because they were too old. So thank you all. Looking forward to continuing to be with you today.